One day when he and the disciples were out on the lake in a boat, and they suddenly saw Jesus, and they were he was walking on the water towards them. They were a little afraid, but then Jesus said, "It is I, don't be afraid." And Peter called out, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." I think that's pretty bold. You call me, and if it's really you, I'm going to be able to walk on the water just the same way you're walking on the water. So Jesus said, "Come." And Peter boldly got out of that boat and began to walk on the water. He actually took some steps on the water towards Jesus. And that certainly did take faith. But then Peter did something. He began to look at the wind and the waves. He got his eyes off of Jesus and began to see the wind blowing up like fury and the waves whipping up. And as soon as he did that, he began to sink. We all know that story. But then Jesus reached out and pulled Peter up, didn't he? Well, the thing that I always think is, even if the sea was absolutely calm, could he have walked on the water anyway? You know what I mean? He got his eyes onto waves and wind, but that's not the reason he was walking on the water. It was God's power, supernaturally, divinely lifting him up. We don't even know how that was, whether it was angels there, just, putting their hands under his feet. I mean, I like to imagine what it could be. I don't know. But to walk on water is to walk by faith. It's to do what seems impossible. And Peter was ready to do that, but then he took his eyes off Jesus. And as soon as you do that, when you begin to look at the natural circumstances around you, they're screaming, "It's impossible, you can't do this." That's when he began to sink. And Jesus knew this about Peter. He knew that Peter's heart was in the right place, that he really wanted to be a man of faith, but he often was influenced by the circumstances around him. He, after all, was human, and he would begin to look at things around him. On the night that Jesus was arrested, Jesus had tried to prepare his disciples for what was to come, that he was going to a place or a point where he would be leaving them. In John, he says, "I'm leaving you, that the Son may be glorified." So he was trying to help them to accept and understand the plan that God had. But Peter boldly replied, "Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison and to death." So here was another very bold and impetuous statement of faith. And I really think that Peter believed that he would stand by Jesus and that he intended to fight for Jesus and fight for the kingdom and defend the Lord. But he didn't really understand. Jesus told Peter, "Before the rooster crows today, Peter, you will deny me 3 times. That must have been a shock to Peter. No way. And then Jesus said these words. He said, "Satan has asked to sift you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail." So Jesus prayed that Peter's faith would not fail. Well, that very evening when the Pharisees and the temple guards came in order to arrest Jesus, Peter tried to carry out his word, tried to be bold in the face of this terrible situation. And what he did is draw his sword and cut off the ear of one of the men that was there arresting Jesus. And I believe that at this moment, Peter's courage and faith were strong, except it was sort of directed to the wrong thing. It wasn't directed in God's plan. So what happened next, I believe, kind of pulled the rug out from under Peter. I think it really baffled him, for Jesus immediately turned and rebuked Peter and said, "Put away your sword. Don't try to defend me. Put away your sword." And then he actually healed the man, undid what Peter had done, just healed the ear, made it whole, everything fine. And I think maybe this was the point when Peter just began to falter. This can't be. This can't be. What's happening? Why is Jesus being arrested like this? Why are they dragging him away in chains? This cannot be. Jesus has a mission to fulfill, and I was going to help him with that. But now I don't know what to do. So I think that Peter was beginning to get his eyes off of Jesus and really looking at the circumstances, and yet he still had enough courage to follow at a distance. And he went into the courtyard of the place where they had taken Jesus, and Jesus was inside being unjustly tried, and Peter began to warm himself, at the little fire there. And it was then that a number of people around him said, I know you. You're one of those followers of Jesus. You were with him. You're one of those Galileans. And in fact, it even says that one of the relatives of the guy that got his ear chopped off said, hey, you were with him. Right then, that's when Peter's faith really began to falter. And he denied Jesus. No, don't even know the man. Don't even know him. I'm just here warming my hands, Well, at that moment, Peter could have utterly despaired. He could have just said, that's it. I have failed the Lord. I have not held faith with Jesus. But what it says he did, he went out and wept bitterly. But we know, thank God, Peter did not give up his faith. For Jesus had said, I've prayed for you that your faith will not fail. And when the awful things happen, you are going to encourage your brethren. That seemed almost impossible, didn't it? And yet we know that Peter went on, and all the disciples betrayed Jesus and were fearful and hiding from the authorities, other than John, who stayed at the cross with his Lord. But Peter, after the death and resurrection of Jesus, became a mighty, mighty man of God and follower of the Lord. And I think he finally kind of learned how to keep his eyes on God and trust that God knew what was happening. I know I can imagine that John at the cross was probably just as much baffled as Peter was, and yet John was the one that had such trust in Jesus. He was the disciple that Jesus loved, he described himself as, the beloved disciple. And I think that he was there utterly amazed, not knowing why this great suffering had to happen, and yet in his heart saying, God, I trust you. Somehow, I trust you. You're going to take this awful situation and turn it around. And so we know that John, actually, of all the disciples, lived the longest. He had that deep, entrenched trust, and he became a great encourager of the early church, even when he was exiled on the island of Patmos. He had, historically it tells us, he had a little congregation there on the island of Patmos, a place for criminals and political outcasts. So, and Peter went on to become a mighty follower of God. I think they all learned that it's so important to keep your eyes on God. And so let us all remember to trust and to never give up. And I just thought, it's wonderful of God to give us in our midst a living witness and example of someone who's kept her eyes on God and has trusted and had faith that God would intervene for her. And that's Ryoko with us today. And just a miracle, really, a miracle of God that Ryoko's back in Canada, that she's got a job in South Windsor and back in our fellowship in our midst. It shows you what faith can do. So let's just give praise to God for that. Just praise God. I saw her. And I thought, aha, overcoming faith. There's the example. So let's have a time of prayer now. We thank you, God, that you're the way, and there was always a way. We thank you that even the way of the cross, the way of suffering and loss, in that way you bring life and hope. We ask you to help us to keep our eyes always trained on you, to trust in faith, so that we too can overcome, for that is our victory, even our faith.